Sometimes the most life-changing moments come wrapped in the smallest packages. When tech mogul Freddie Montes stopped at Riverside Children's Home on a rainy Thursday afternoon to deliver a corporate donation check, he had no idea that three simple words from a 7-year-old girl would shatter his carefully constructed world and rebuild it into something he never knew he needed. The sleek black Tesla pulled into the gravel parking lot of Riverside Children's Home with the quiet efficiency that marked everything in Freddie Montes's precisely orchestrated life. At 34, he commanded a tech empire worth over $200 million, lived in a penthouse overlooking the Hudson River, and maintained a schedule so tight that even charitable obligations were allocated exactly 45 minutes, no more, no less. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Freddie adjusted his Italian wool coat against the October drizzle as he approached the weathered brick building that housed 43 children between the ages of 4 and 17. The structure had clearly seen better decades, its paint peeling around window frames that looked like they hadn't been updated since the 1980s. A small playground sat to one side, its equipment showing signs of loving overuse and careful maintenance by people who understood the value of making things last. The $50,000 check in his breast pocket represented a tax-deductible donation that his accountant had suggested and his assistant had efficiently arranged. Freddie had built his fortune on automation software that helped corporations streamline their operations, eliminating inefficiencies and maximizing profits. He approached philanthropy with the same systematic precision he brought to business dealings: clean, quick, and professionally distanced. Sarah Wellington, the home's director, greeted him at the entrance with the kind of warm smile that immediately made Freddie slightly uncomfortable. At 52, she possessed the patient demeanor of someone who had spent 2 decades helping children navigate the complexities of growing up without permanent families. Her office, cluttered with children's artwork and thank you letters from former residents, stood in sharp contrast to Freddie's minimalist corporate environment, where every surface was deliberately clear and every appointment served a measurable purpose. "Mr. Montes, we're so grateful for your generosity," Sarah said, accepting the check with genuine appreciation rather than the practiced enthusiasm he'd expected from someone in the nonprofit sector. "This donation will help us replace the heating system before winter really sets in. You have no idea how much this means to our kids." Freddie nodded with the polite efficiency of someone completing a transaction. "I'm glad the funds will be put to good use. As I mentioned to your development coordinator, I have another appointment at 4:30, so if we could keep this brief." But as they walked through the hallway toward the exit, the sound of children's voices drifted from the common room, and Sarah paused with the expression of someone who had just remembered something important. "Would you like to see how your donation directly impacts our daily operations? The children are just finishing their afternoon snack, and some of them have been asking about the nice man who helped fix their heater." Freddie glanced at his watch, calculating the time against his evening schedule. His personal trainer expected him at 5:15, followed by a conference call with investors in Singapore at 6:30. Deviating from planned schedules created inefficiencies that rippled through carefully structured routines. But something in Sarah's expression suggested this wasn't merely a fundraising strategy, and his business instincts recognized the value of maintaining positive relationships with charitable organizations for future tax planning purposes. 5 minutes, he agreed, following her into a spacious room where children of various ages sat around mismatched tables, their animated conversations creating the kind of cheerful chaos that Freddie's orderly world rarely encountered. The room itself told stories of creative resourcefulness. Donated furniture had been arranged to create cozy conversation areas, while children's artwork covered every available wall space in a riot of color and imagination. A bookshelf in one corner overflowed with well-loved volumes, and a basket of coys suggested that play and learning happened simultaneously in this space where 43 children called home. "Everyone," Sarah announced with gentle authority, "I'd like you to meet Mr. Montes. He's the generous person who helped make sure we'll stay warm all winter long." A chorus of thank yous erupted from the children, ranging from shy whispers to enthusiastic shouts depending on age and personality. Freddie found himself unexpectedly moved by their genuine gratitude for something as basic as adequate heating, a need he had never had to consider in his climate-controlled penthouse, where temperature was managed by smart home technology that adjusted automatically to his preferences.
But it was the little girl in the corner who captured his attention completely. 7-year-old Lily Chen sat alone at a small table, her dark hair pulled back in uneven pigtails that suggested she'd styled it herself. Unlike the other children who had immediately focused on the visitor, Lily was absorbed in what appeared to be a drawing project, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she worked with a set of well-worn crayons. "Lily's been with us for 8 months, Sarah explained quietly, noting Freddie's interest. "She's incredibly bright and creative, but she tends to be more reserved around new people. Her parents died in a car accident last winter, and she's still processing a lot of complex emotions." Freddie found himself walking toward Lily's table, drawn by something he couldn't quite identify. Her drawing depicted a house with careful attention to architectural details that impressed him. Windows and doors proportioned correctly, a garden with individually rendered flowers, and smoke curling from a chimney that suggested warmth and permanence. "That's beautiful work," Freddie said, kneeling beside her chair to better appreciate the artistic effort. "You're very talented." Lily looked up at him with large brown eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any 7-year-old should possess. She studied his face with the careful assessment of someone who had learned that adults didn't always mean what they said, but who still hoped to find evidence of genuine kindness. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'm drawing the house I'm going to live in someday when someone adopts me. It has a big kitchen where we can cook together, and a backyard where I can have a dog, and a room that's just mine, with bookshelves and a window that looks out at trees." The matter-of-fact way she described her future home hit Freddie like a physical blow. Here was a child who had lost everything most people took for granted, yet she maintained enough hope to envision a detailed future filled with the simple comforts of family life. Her drawing wasn't just art, it was a blueprint for belonging, created with the faith that somewhere in the world someone was waiting to give her the stability she craved. "What kind of dog would you want?" Freddie found himself asking, genuinely curious about her answer rather than making conversation to fill awkward silence. Lily's face lit up with the first genuine smile he'd seen since entering the building. "A golden retriever named Honey. They're gentle and loyal, and they love children. I've been reading about different dog breeds in the library books, and golden retrievers are perfect for families because they're patient and smart, and they like to play, but they also like to cuddle." The specificity of her research touched something in Freddie's chest that he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't a child making casual wishes. This was someone who had spent serious time considering every aspect of the life she hoped to build. She had studied dog breeds with the same thoroughness he brought to business acquisitions, understanding that knowledge increased the likelihood of making good decisions. "You've done your homework," Freddie observed, settling into the chair beside her as his 45-minute time limit completely evaporated from his consciousness. "Mrs. Wellington says that being prepared helps good things happen, so I'm learning about everything I'll need to know to be part of a real family. How to help with cooking and cleaning, how to take care of pets, how to be a good daughter." The phrase, "how to be a good daughter," stopped my breath entirely. Here was a child who believed she needed to earn love through performance, who thought family membership required passing some kind of test. The innocence and heartbreak contained in that single sentence made my throat tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. As if sensing his thoughts, Lily directly looked at him with those serious brown eyes and asked the question that would change both their lives forever. "Will you be my daddy?" The words hung in the air like a bridge between two different worlds, one where love was a business transaction measured in efficiency and profit margins, and another where it was freely offered by a 7-year-old who had every reason to guard her heart but chose hope instead. In that moment, surrounded by the warm chaos of children's voices and the evidence of lives being lived with courage despite circumstance, Freddie Montes felt the first crack in the armor he'd built around his heart, since his own childhood had taught him that emotional investments rarely generated positive returns. Freddie Montes had built his fortress of solitude long before he'd earned his first million. The penthouse apartment on Manhattan's Upper East Side reflected his philosophy of life: clean lines, minimal distractions, maximum efficiency. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of Central Park, but Freddie rarely paused to appreciate it. Views were real estate value, not sources of contemplation.
His daily routine operated with the precision of Swiss clockwork. 5:30 a.m. wake-up, 30 minutes of high-intensity exercise in his private gym, shower, protein shake, review of overnight market reports from Asian exchanges. By 7 a.m., he was in his home office, managing a software empire that had grown from a college dorm room startup to a company employing over 3,000 people across 14 countries. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who had built his fortune on connection technology lived in almost complete isolation. His automation software helped families stay in touch across continents, enabled small businesses to compete with corporate giants, and streamlined communication for millions of users worldwide. Yet Freddie's personal phone contacts consisted of his assistant Patricia, his accountant, his lawyer, his personal trainer, and exactly 4 business associates who occasionally qualified as something approaching friends. He hadn't always been this way. The photograph tucked in his desk drawer, rarely looked at but never discarded, showed a different version of himself. 7-year-old Freddie Montes, with gap-toothed grin, arms wrapped around his younger sister Amelia outside their modest home in Buffalo, New York. Their parents, both working multiple jobs to make ends meet, had promised a stability that economic reality made impossible to deliver. The turning point had come when Freddie was 9 and Amelia was 6. Their father's factory job disappeared in a wave of corporate downsizing. Their mother's part-time retail work couldn't cover the mortgage, and the family home was sold to pay debts. For 8 months, they'd lived with relatives who made it clear that charity had expiration dates. Then came the foster care system, where Freddie learned that emotional investment in temporary situations only multiplied the pain when inevitable separations occurred. Amelia had been adopted first, chosen by a warm family in Oregon who fell in love with her sunny disposition and artistic talents. Freddie remained in the system for 3 more years, cycling through 7 different homes, each placement reinforcing his growing belief that relying on others led to disappointment. By age 12, he developed a protective strategy: academic excellence combined with emotional distance. If he couldn't control love, he could control success. The strategy had worked brilliantly from a financial perspective. Full scholarship to MIT, where his software innovations caught the attention of venture capitalists before he had even graduated. By 25, he'd sold his first company for $40 million. By 30, his second company had gone public, making him worth over $100 million. By 34, he commanded enough resources to solve almost any problem, except the one that mattered most: the growing emptiness that no amount of professional achievement seemed to fill. His relationship with Amelia existed in carefully scheduled quarterly phone calls and birthday cards with generous checks.
She'd married a high school teacher, lived in a small house in Portland with her husband and twin daughters, and seemed genuinely happy with a life that prioritized time over money, relationships over achievements. Her attempts to include Freddie in family gatherings were gently but consistently declined. He sent expensive gifts for the twins' birthdays and Christmas, but had never met his nieces in person. The charitable donations that brought him to Riverside Children's Home represented a tax-efficient method of giving back to society while maintaining the emotional distance that had served him well in business. Writing checks felt safer than direct involvement. Money could solve problems without requiring the messy complications of personal investment or ongoing commitment. But Lily Chen's simple question had cracked something fundamental in the armor he'd spent 25 years constructing. 3 words, "Will you be my daddy?" delivered with the absolute trust of a child who still believed adults could be relied upon to care for people smaller and more vulnerable than themselves. The drive back to Manhattan passed in a blur of traffic and conflicting thoughts. Freddie found himself taking the long route through Central Park, something he never did, as if his subconscious needed extra time to process what had happened at the children's home. His perfectly climate-controlled Tesla felt suddenly too quiet, too isolated from the world outside its tinted windows. Patricia, his assistant for the past 6 years, noticed the change immediately when he arrived at the office 90 minutes behind schedule. Patricia Chen, no relation to Lily despite the shared surname, had learned to read her boss's moods with the precision required to manage someone whose decisions affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars in daily transactions. Your 4:30 with the Singapore team has been moved to 5:15 to accommodate the delay. And Jennifer from the Times called about the interview for next week's Technology Spotlight. She'd like to include some personal background if you're comfortable with that direction. Freddie nodded absently, but his mind remained focused on a 7-year-old's drawing of a house with carefully proportioned windows and a garden full of individually rendered flowers. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering what his life might look like if it includes someone other than business associates and service providers. The Singapore conference call proceeded with its usual efficiency, but Freddie caught himself thinking about Lily's research into dog breeds instead of focusing on quarterly projections and market expansion strategies. When the call ended, he found himself staring out his office window at the city lights beginning to flicker on in the early evening darkness. His apartment that night felt different somehow. The minimalist furniture that had once represented sophisticated success now seemed sterile, lacking any evidence that an actual human being lived there. The refrigerator contained the same selection of prepared meals from an expensive organic delivery service. The living room shelves displayed awards and business magazines instead of family photographs or personal mementos. Freddie sat at his dining table, designed for entertaining clients, but primarily used as a workspace, and opened his laptop to research something that had never appeared in any of his previous Google searches. Private Adoption Process, New York State. The information was overwhelming and heartening simultaneously. Background checks, home studies, financial evaluations, parenting classes, psychological assessments. The process could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on circumstances and the specific needs of the child in question. Then he found himself on Riverside Children's Home's website, reading profiles of children available for adoption. Lily's page showed the same serious brown eyes that had asked him to be her daddy, along with information that made his chest tight with emotion. Lily enjoys reading, art projects, and helping with household tasks. She dreams of having a family who will teach her to cook and take her to the library. She would do well in a home that values education and provides stability and patience as she continues to process the loss of her parents. At midnight, Freddie made a phone call that 6 months earlier would have been impossible to imagine. His sister Amelia answered on the third ring, her voice groggy with sleep, but immediately alert when she heard his voice. "Freddie, is everything okay? You never call this late." "I met someone today," he said without preamble. "A 7-year-old girl at a children's home. She asked me to be her father." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Freddie wondered if the call had dropped. Then Amelia's voice returned, softer, but filled with something that sounded like hope. "And what did you tell her?" "I didn't know what to tell her. I don't know anything about being a father. I don't know anything about taking care of anyone other than myself." "Freddie," Amelia said gently, "neither do most people when they start. The important part is wanting to learn." As he finally fell asleep that night, Freddie found himself thinking not about market projections or acquisition strategies, but about golden retrievers named Honey and little girls who drew houses with the faith that someone, somewhere, was waiting to fill them with love. The following weeks brought an unexpected transformation to Freddie's carefully ordered existence. What had begun as late-night research into adoption procedures evolved into something resembling an obsession, though he preferred to think of it as thorough due diligence. His browser history, once filled exclusively with financial reports and technology blogs, now included articles about child psychology, single-parent adoption statistics, and the long-term effects of early trauma on development. Patricia noticed the change immediately. Her boss, who had once scheduled bathroom breaks for maximum efficiency, now spent long minutes staring out his office window with the expression of someone solving a complex equation in his head. Conference calls that had once commanded his complete attention now competed with his distracted glances at his phone, where he'd saved the Riverside Children's Home website as a bookmark. "Mr. Montes," Patricia said during their Monday morning briefing, her tone carrying the diplomatic concern of someone who had learned to navigate her employer's moods with professional discretion. "The Peterson acquisition requires your final approval on the contract terms, and the legal team need your decision by end of business today." Freddie nodded absently, signing the documents without his usual detailed review. The acquisition represented a $40 million purchase that 6 months ago would have consumed weeks of his attention. Now it felt like routine paperwork, less important than the email he'd received from Sarah Wellington, thanking him again for his donation and mentioning that Lily had asked about him several times since his visit. The first return visit to Riverside Children's Home happened almost by accident. Freddie had been driving home from a client meeting in Westchester when he found himself taking the exit toward the children's home instead of continuing toward Manhattan. He sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, engine running, trying to convince himself that unscheduled social visits fell outside his established behavioral patterns. But Lily's question continued to echo in his thoughts with the persistence of a melody he couldn't quite forget. "Will you be my daddy?" 3 words that had somehow rewired his entire understanding of what life could contain beyond professional achievements and financial security.
Sarah Wellington greeted his unexpected arrival with the warm surprise of someone who had hoped for exactly this development. "Mr. Montes, what a lovely surprise! Lily will be so excited to see you. She's been telling everyone about the nice man who liked her house drawing." The common room buzzed with the same cheerful energy Freddie remembered from his first visit, but this time he found himself paying attention to details that had escaped his notice before. The way the older children helped younger ones with homework, the careful sharing of limited supplies, the genuine affection that connected kids who had found family in each other despite their individual circumstances. Lily sat at the same corner table,
this time working on what appeared to be a school assignment. Her math worksheet showed evidence of careful effort, numbers written with the precise penmanship of someone who took academic responsibility seriously. When she looked up and saw Freddie approaching, her face lit up with the kind of unguarded joy that made his chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. "You came back," she said, as if his return confirmed something important she had been hoping for but hadn't dared to expect. "I was in the neighborhood," Freddie replied, then immediately felt foolish for offering such an obviously inadequate explanation to a 7-year-old who deserved better honesty. Lily studied his face with the same careful assessment she'd displayed during their first meeting, but this time her expression held less wariness and more curiosity. "Mrs. Wellington says when grown-ups come back to visit, it usually means they're thinking about something important." The directness of her observation caught Freddie off guard. He had spent his adult life in business environments where conversations involved multiple layers of subtext and strategic positioning. But Lily communicated with the refreshing honesty of someone who hadn't yet learned to hide her thoughts behind diplomatic language. "What kind of important things?" Freddie asked, settling into the chair beside her with the same easy familiarity he'd felt during their first conversation. "Family things," Lily said simply, as if this were the most obvious answer in the world. "Like when people are thinking about adoption, or when they want to help kids find permanent homes." Mrs. Wellington explained that some adults need time to make sure they're ready for such a big responsibility. Her matter-of-fact discussion of adoption procedures impressed Freddie with its sophistication. This wasn't a child who harbored unrealistic fantasies about instant family formation. She understood that adult decisions required careful consideration and practical planning. "Have you thought about what kind of family you'd want to join?" Freddie found himself asking, genuinely curious about her criteria for potential parents. Lily's answer revealed the depth of consideration she'd given to this question. "I want parents who read books and like to learn new things, and who won't get mad when I ask lots of questions about how things work, and who will teach me to cook real food, not just microwave stuff, and who understand that sometimes I get sad about my first parents, and that doesn't mean I don't love my new family." Each item on her list demonstrated remarkable emotional maturity for someone her age. She had thought through not just the practical aspects of family life, but the complex emotional dynamics of joining a new family while processing grief from losing her original one. "Those sound like very reasonable requirements," Freddie observed, struck by how closely her criteria matched qualities he'd been discovering in himself through their conversations. "What about you?" Lily asked, with the directness that had become familiar. "Have you ever thought about having a family?" The question forced Freddie to confront thoughts he'd been avoiding since their first meeting. His penthouse apartment, his carefully structured schedule, his successful but solitary existence suddenly felt less like achievements and more like limitations he'd imposed on himself out of fear rather than choice. "I used to think my work was enough," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. "But lately, I've been wondering if maybe I've been missing something important." Lily nodded with the wisdom of someone who understood that adults sometimes needed help figuring out what should be obvious. "Mrs. Wellington says that families make people braver because when you have people who love you no matter what, you can try new things without being scared of messing up." Her insight cut straight to the heart of Freddie's lifelong pattern of emotional self-protection. He had built his success on minimizing risk through careful control of variables. But family life required exactly the kind of emotional investment he'd spent years avoiding. The visit stretched from 30 minutes to 2 hours as Freddie found himself drawn into Lily's world in ways he hadn't anticipated. She showed him her collection of library books about science and nature, each one filled with careful notes in her precise handwriting. She explained her system for organizing her few personal belongings to maximize the limited space of institutional living. She introduced her to her best friend Amanda, a 9-year-old who had been at Riverside for almost 3 years and served as an unofficial big sister to newer arrivals. "Lily's really smart," Amanda confided, during a moment when Lily was showing her artwork to other visitors. "She helps everyone with homework, and she never gets mean even when kids are being difficult. She's going to make someone a really good daughter."
The casual endorsement from another child carried more weight than any professional evaluation could have provided. Amanda had no agenda beyond genuine affection for her friend, and her assessment of Lily's character came from months of daily interaction rather than brief supervised visits. As the afternoon wound down, Freddie found himself reluctant to leave. The institutional setting that had initially felt foreign and overwhelming now seemed warm and welcoming, filled with evidence of resilience and hope despite circumstances that would challenge any adult's optimism. "Will you come back again?" Lily asked as he prepared to leave, her question carrying the vulnerability of someone who had learned not to take adult promises for granted. "Yes," Freddie replied, making a commitment that felt more significant than any business contract he'd ever signed. "I'd like to come back regularly, if that's okay with you." Lily's smile and response was worth more than any quarterly profit report he'd ever received. The drive back to Manhattan passed in contemplative silence as Freddie processed the afternoon's revelations. His conversation with Lily had clarified something he'd been struggling to articulate even to himself. This wasn't about charity or social obligation. This was about recognizing that his carefully constructed life, while financially successful, had become emotionally insufficient. That evening, he made the phone call he'd been avoiding for weeks. The adoption agency's intake coordinator scheduled his initial consultation for the following Thursday, explaining that the process would involve extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, parenting classes, and home studies that could take anywhere from 6 months to a year to complete. "Most single parents find the process challenging but ultimately rewarding," the agency's coordinator explained. "The agency's priority is ensuring that both children and prospective parents are prepared for the realities of forming new family bonds." As Freddie ended the call and looked around his minimalist apartment, he realized that preparing for fatherhood would require more than just completing paperwork and attending classes. It would require transforming not just his living space, but his entire understanding of what made life meaningful. For the first time since childhood, Freddie Monteras found himself planning for a future that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or market share, but in the immeasurable rewards of loving someone more than himself. The adoption consultation meeting took place in a nondescript office building in downtown Manhattan, where Janet Morrison, the agency's senior caseworker, conducted interviews that would determine whether prospective parents possessed the emotional stability and practical resources necessary for successful family formation. Janet had spent 15 years evaluating adults who wanted to become parents, and she possessed the kind of direct assessment skills that made corporate executives uncomfortable. "Mr. Montes," Janet began, reviewing the preliminary paperwork Freddie had completed with the same thoroughness he brought to merger documents, "your financial qualifications are certainly adequate, but I notice you've indicated no previous experience with children and very limited family relationships. Can you help me understand what's motivating your interest in adoption at this stage of your life?" The question forced Freddie to articulate something he'd been struggling to explain even to himself. How could he convey the profound impact of a 7-year-old's innocent question without sounding like someone experiencing a midlife crisis or temporary emotional impulse? "I met a child at Riverside Children's Home," he said carefully, choosing his words with the precision he usually reserved for contract negotiations. "Her name is Lily Chin, and she asked me to be her father. The request made me realize that my life, while professionally successful, lacks the kind of meaningful relationships that give existence purpose beyond financial achievement." Janet made notes with the practiced efficiency of someone who had heard similar explanations from hundreds of prospective parents. And what specifically about this child's request resonated with you? Many children in institutional care form quick attachments to adult visitors. Freddie considered the question, recognizing that Janet was probing for evidence of genuine commitment rather than romantic notions about rescue fantasies. "Lily isn't looking for rescue," he replied after a moment. "She's looking for partnership. She's researched what family life requires, she understands that adoption involves complex emotional adjustments, and she's prepared to contribute to household responsibilities while processing her own grief about losing her biological parents. Her maturity impressed me, but more than that, her hopefulness challenged my assumption that emotional investment inevitably leads to disappointment." Janet's expression shifted slightly, suggesting that his answer had provided insight she found professionally relevant. "Tell me about your own childhood experience with family stability."
The question opened territories Freddie rarely discussed, even with his sister. But something about Janet's direct approach made evasion feel counterproductive rather than protective. He found himself describing the factory closure, the foreclosure, the foster care system, and the lessons he'd learned about self-reliance as a survival strategy rather than a choice. "So, you've experienced family disruption from a child's perspective," Janet observed when he finished. "How do you think that background prepares you for providing stability to another child who has experienced similar losses?" "I understand what she needs because I needed the same thing," Freddie replied, recognizing the truth as he spoke it. "Lily needs someone who won't disappear when circumstances become difficult, who will invest in her education and future without expecting her to earn love through performance. She needs consistency, patience, and the security of knowing that someone considers her well-being more important than their own convenience." Janet continued her assessment for another hour, covering topics that ranged from financial planning for educational expenses to conflict resolution strategies for handling behavioral challenges that might arise during family adjustment periods. Her questions were designed to identify potential problems before they became crises, and Freddie found himself appreciating her thoroughness despite the personal discomfort of such detailed scrutiny. The next step involves psychological evaluation, background investigation, and home study assessment, Janet explained as the session concluded. The process typically takes 6 to 9 months, during which time you'll be required to complete 40 hours of parenting education classes. I should also mention that if you're interested in adopting Lily specifically, she would need to consent to the placement, and her social worker would need to determine that you represent the best available option for her long-term welfare. Walking back to his office through the familiar streets of Manhattan, Freddie felt the weight of transformation settling over his carefully ordered existence. The psychological evaluation would examine thought patterns and emotional responses he'd spent decades keeping private. The home study would require opening his personal space to official scrutiny. The parenting classes would place him in rooms full of people whose life experiences differed dramatically from his isolated professional trajectory. But more challenging than any bureaucratic requirement was the prospect of returning to Riverside Children's Home to have an honest conversation with Lily about his intentions. Children who had experienced abandonment possessed sophisticated early warning systems for detecting adult unreliability, and Lily would need concrete evidence that his interest represented genuine commitment rather than temporary sentiment. The opportunity for that conversation came sooner than expected. Sarah Wellington called his office the following afternoon with news that Lily had been asking about him regularly since his last visit, wondering whether he would return and whether his disappearance meant she had said something wrong during their conversation. "She's not upset exactly," Sarah explained with the diplomatic tone of someone accustomed to managing complex emotional situations, "but she's exhibiting some of the withdrawal behaviors we see when children begin protecting themselves against anticipated disappointment. I thought you should know that your visits have become emotionally significant for her, which means irregular contact could be more harmful than helpful." The implication was clear. Casual involvement was no longer an option. Either Freddie committed to consistent presence in Lily's life,
or he needed to step away completely to avoid causing additional trauma to a child who had already experienced too much loss. That evening, Freddie found himself standing in what had once been his home office, now envisioning how the space might function as a child's bedroom. The sleek desk could be replaced with age-appropriate furniture. The walls, currently decorated with framed business awards, could display children's artwork and educational posters. The adjoining bathroom would need child-safe modifications and storage for the countless small items that seemed to accumulate around young people. His sister Amelia answered his call on the second ring, her voice immediately alert to the unusual timing of his contact. "Freddie? 2 calls in 1 month. This must be serious." "I'm going through with the adoption," he said without preamble, needing to voice the decision aloud to make it feel real. "I met with the agency today, and I'm starting the formal process." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Freddie wondered if Amelia was processing shock or concerned about his judgment. When she finally spoke, her voice carried emotion he hadn't heard since their childhood conversations about their dreams for the future. "What's her name?" Amelia asked, somehow understanding that his decision centered around a specific child rather than abstract parental desires. "Lily Chen. She's 7 years old, loves to read, draws detailed pictures of houses she wants to live in, and asked me to be her father with the kind of directness that made lying to myself impossible." "And what did you tell her?"
I haven't told her anything yet. I wanted to make sure I could follow through before making promises to someone who has already experienced too many broken commitments from adults. Amelia's response surprised him with its immediate certainty. "Freddie, the fact that you're worried about keeping promises means you're already thinking like a parent. When can I meet her?" The question caught him off guard. In his careful planning for single parenthood, he hadn't considered how adoption would affect his relationship with his sister, or how Lily might benefit from having an aunt and cousins who could expand her understanding of family beyond the 2-person unit he'd been envisioning. "The process takes 6 to 9 months, he explained. "Background checks, psychological evaluation, parenting classes, home study assessment. If everything goes well and Lily agrees to the placement, maybe we could arrange a meeting next spring." "I'll start planning a visit to New York," Amelia said with the practical efficiency she'd inherited from their mother. "And Freddie, I'm proud of you for choosing love over fear. It's the bravest thing you've ever done." After ending the call, Freddie sat in his minimalist living room and tried to imagine it filled with the controlled chaos of family life. Lily's books scattered across the coffee table, her artwork taped to the refrigerator, her questions about how things worked interrupting his concentration during conference calls. The prospect should have felt overwhelming to someone who had spent years eliminating unpredictability from his environment. Instead, it felt like coming alive after years of merely existing. The next morning brought an email from Janet Morrison confirming his acceptance into the adoption preparation program and providing a schedule for the required classes that would begin the following week. Attached was a reading list that included titles about trauma-informed parenting, single-father adoption experiences, and age-appropriate communication strategies for discussing difficult topics with children who had experienced loss. As Freddie reviewed the materials that would guide his transformation from isolated executive to committed father, he realized that Lily's simple question had initiated the most important business transaction of his life. Not the acquisition of a company or the development of innovative software, but the deliberate construction of a family built on love rather than convenience, hope rather than fear, and the revolutionary idea that caring for someone else might be the key to caring for himself. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday morning in the form of a phone call that shattered Freddie's carefully planned timeline. Sarah Wellington's voice carried the controlled urgency of someone delivering news that would change everything, despite her efforts to soften the impact through professional diplomacy. "Mr. Montes, I'm calling because we've received an inquiry about Lily from a family in Connecticut.
The Riversons have been approved for adoption and specifically requested to meet children in Lily's age range who might benefit from placement in a traditional two-parent household with existing children. Freddie felt his chest constrict as the implications became clear. While he had been methodically working through psychological evaluations and parenting classes, other prospective parents had been moving through the same system with potentially faster results. His careful, business-like approach to family formation suddenly seemed inadequate against the reality of competition for Lily's future. The agency requires that we present all viable options to children who are available for adoption, Sarah continued, her tone gentle but firm. Lily will need to meet with the Riversons next week, and if she's comfortable with the arrangement, they could potentially finalize placement within 60 days. The 60-day timeline hit Freddie like a physical blow. His own adoption process was still months away from completion, held up by the thorough background investigations that his complex financial holdings required. While he had been treating the adoption process like a long-term strategic initiative, other families had been operating with the urgency that he should have recognized from the beginning. "What about Lily's preferences?" Freddie asked, struggling to maintain professional composure while his carefully constructed plans crumbled around him. Children's preferences are considered, but they're not the determining factor. Our primary responsibility is ensuring that each child is placed in the most suitable long-term situation available. The Riversons have 2 biological children, ages 9 and 12, a stable marriage of 15 years, and extensive experience with foster care placement. On paper, they represent exactly the kind of family environment that adoption agencies consider ideal. On paper. The phrase highlighted everything that was problematic about Freddie's situation. On paper, he was a wealthy single man with no parenting experience, limited family relationships, and a psychological profile that revealed decades of emotional self-protection. On paper, the Riversons offered stability, experience, and the kind of traditional family structure that social workers were trained to prefer. But on paper didn't account for the connection he'd felt with Lily, the way her questions had challenged his assumptions about what made life meaningful, or the fact that she had specifically asked him to be her father. On paper didn't capture the hours he had spent researching child development, the way he had begun reorganizing his life around the possibility of fatherhood, and the fundamental shift in his priorities that had occurred since their first conversation. "When does she meet them?" Freddie asked, already calculating whether he could accelerate his own adoption timeline through additional resources or expedited processing. "Friday afternoon. I'll be conducting the introduction meeting, and if it goes well, they'd like to arrange a weekend visit to their home in Stamford. Lily seems nervous about the prospect, which is normal for children who have been in care for extended periods, but she's agreed to meet with them."
After ending the call, Freddie sat in his office, staring at the Manhattan skyline without seeing it, trying to process the reality that his plans for fatherhood might be ending before they had truly begun. The rational part of his mind recognized that the Riversons probably could provide Lily with advantages he couldn't offer: siblings, a mother figure, a suburban environment with yards and neighborhood playmates. But the emotional part of his mind, the part that had been growing stronger since their first meeting, rebelled against the idea of losing her to a family that hadn't been chosen by her own innocent wisdom. That evening, he made a decision that would have been impossible for the person he'd been 6 months earlier. Instead of approaching the problem through official channels and bureaucratic procedures, Freddie drove directly to Riverside Children's Home to have an honest conversation with Lily about the choice she was facing. He found her in the common room, sitting alone at her usual table with a book about marine biology that looked far too advanced for her grade level. When she saw him approaching, her face lit up with the kind of unguarded happiness that made his heart clench with the possibility of losing it forever. "You came at a different time," Lily observed, closing her book carefully and marking her place with a strip of paper. "Mrs. Wellington said you usually visit on Saturday afternoons." "I wanted to talk to you about something important," Freddie said, settling into the chair beside her with the gravity that serious conversations required.
Mrs. Wellington probably told you that another family wants to meet you. Lily nodded solemnly, her expression shifting from joy to the careful guardedness he recognized from their first meeting. The Riversons? They have 2 kids already, and a big house with a swimming pool. Mrs. Wellington showed me pictures. How do you feel about meeting them? Lily considered the question with the thoughtfulness that had impressed him from their first conversation. Scared, I think, but also maybe excited? They seem nice in their pictures, and having brothers and sisters might be fun, but she trailed off, staring at her book without seeing the pages. What but, Lily? But I asked you to be my daddy, and you never gave me an answer. And now there are other people who want me, and I don't know if that means you decided you didn't want me after all, or if you're still thinking about it, or if I did something wrong that made you change your mind. The raw honesty in her words hit Freddie with the force of everything he'd been trying to protect himself from feeling. Here was a 7-year-old child who had offered him his heart with complete trust, and his careful, methodical approach to decision-making had left her wondering whether she was worthy of love. "Lily," he said, his voice rougher than intended, "you didn't do anything wrong. I've been working through the adoption process, which takes time because adults have to prove they're ready to be good parents. But I should have told you what I was doing instead of leaving you to guess." She looked up at him with those serious brown eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than any child should possess. "So, you do want to be my daddy?" "More than I've ever wanted anything in my life," Freddie replied, surprised by the absoluteness of his certainty. "But the adoption process for someone like me takes longer than it does for families like the Riversons. They're already approved and ready to take you home, while I still have months of classes and evaluations ahead of me." Lily absorbed this information with the practical acceptance of someone who had learned that adult systems didn't always align with emotional realities. "So, you want me, but they can have me sooner?" "That's right. And Mrs. Wellington's job is to find you the best family as quickly as possible. The Riversons can give you things I can't. A mother, siblings, a house in the suburbs with that swimming pool. They're probably the kind of family that would be perfect for most children." "But I'm not most children," Lily said with quiet determination. "I'm me. And I asked you to be my daddy because something about you felt right, not because I was looking for the biggest house or the most people." Her words cut through every rational argument about the Riversons' superior qualifications. Lily hadn't chosen him based on a comparative analysis of available options. She had chosen him based on an intuitive recognition that had nothing to do with swimming pools or existing children or 15 years of stable marriage. "What if I told you that I'm going to fight for you?" Freddie asked, making a commitment that terrified and exhilarated him simultaneously. "What if I promised that I won't give up on becoming your father, even if it takes longer than other options?" Lily's smile in response was worth more than every business success he'd ever achieved. "Then I guess I should meet the Riversons so I can tell them thank you, but I'm waiting for my real daddy to finish his paperwork." That night, Freddie began making phone calls that would have been unthinkable during his previous existence. He contacted Janet Morrison to inquire about expedited processing options. He spoke with lawyers who specialized in adoption law about potential strategies for accelerating his timeline. He researched private adoption agencies that might offer faster alternatives to the state system. But more importantly, he called his sister Amelia to ask for help with something that couldn't be solved through money or professional connections. "I need character references," he told her without preamble. "People who can testify that I'm capable of being a good father despite having no experience with children. And I need them to be willing to appear before a judge, if necessary, to argue that sometimes the best family isn't the most obvious choice on paper." "You've got them," Amelia replied without hesitation. "When do we start?" The response to Freddie's crisis came from the most unexpected quarter imaginable.
Within 48 hours of his conversation with Amelia, his phone began ringing with calls from people he'd never imagined would involve themselves in his personal life. Patricia, his assistant, had somehow learned about his situation through the informal network that connected everyone who worked in his building, and she'd taken it upon herself to mobilize resources with the efficiency that made her invaluable in corporate settings. "Mr. Montes," Patricia announced during what was supposed to be a routine Monday morning briefing, "I've taken the liberty of contacting several individuals who can provide character references for your adoption application. I hope you don't mind the presumption, but time appears to be a critical factor." The list she presented included names that surprised Freddie with both their prominence and their willingness to involve themselves in his personal affairs. Dr. Michael Torres, the pediatric oncologist who had treated children and families that received grants from Freddie's corporate foundation, had offered to testify about his consistent support for medical programs serving vulnerable populations. Rebecca Walsh, the director of literacy programs that his company sponsored in underserved schools, wanted to speak about his long-term commitment to educational initiatives that benefited children similar to Lily. Most surprising was the call from James Harrison, the CEO of a competing software company whom Freddie had considered more rival than ally. "Montes," Harrison said without preamble when Freddie returned his call, "I heard through the grapevine that you're trying to adopt a kid and some bureaucrat is giving you trouble because you're single. That's bullshit. You've been the most ethical competitor in this industry for 10 years, and anyone who can build a company like yours while maintaining that level of integrity can certainly raise one little girl." The support materialized from directions Freddie hadn't anticipated because he'd never realized how many people had been observing his character from a distance. The doorman in his building volunteered to testify about his consistent courtesy towards service workers. The owner of the deli where Freddie bought lunch most days wanted to describe his habit of purchasing meals for homeless individuals without seeking recognition. Even his dry cleaner, Mrs. Kim, somehow learned about the situation and insisted on writing a letter about his reliability and respectfulness during their brief interactions over 5 years of business. But the most significant support came from an entirely different source. Sarah Wellington called on Wednesday afternoon with news that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. "Mr. Montes, I wanted to update you on Lily's meeting with the Riversons. The introduction went well from the family's perspective, but Lily's response was unexpected." Freddie felt his stomach clench with anticipation. "What happened?" "She was polite and engaged during the conversation, asked thoughtful questions about their family life, and seemed to enjoy meeting their children. But when I asked her privately how she felt about the possibility of joining their family, she told me she was grateful for their interest, but had already chosen her father." The words hit Freddie with a mixture of joy and terror. Lily's loyalty meant everything to him, but it also placed her in the position of potentially rejecting a stable family situation while waiting for an outcome that remained uncertain despite all the support he was receiving. The Riversons were disappointed, of course, but they were also impressed by Lily's clarity about her preferences. Mrs. Riverson said she'd never encountered a child who articulated her feelings so clearly about family placement. They've decided to withdraw their application to adopt Lily specifically, though they remain interested in meeting other children. Relief flooded through Freddie so intensely that he had to sit down. Lily's decision had eliminated the immediate threat of losing her to another family, but it had also placed additional pressure on him to succeed with his own adoption process. If he failed now, Lily would remain in institutional care while waiting for someone who might never be able to provide the family she deserved. The following morning brought a phone call that demonstrated how networks of support could create opportunities that individual effort alone could never achieve. Judge Margaret Chen, no relation to Lily, served on the family court bench that handled adoption cases, and she had received multiple calls from respected community members advocating for Freddie's petition to receive expedited consideration. "Mr. Montes," Judge Chen explained when she called personally, "it's unusual for adoption cases to generate this level of community engagement. I've spoken with Dr. Torres, Ms. Walsh, and several other individuals who paint a picture of someone whose character and resources make him well-suited for single-parent adoption. I'm willing to schedule a hearing within 2 weeks if you can complete your remaining requirements by that deadline. 2 weeks. The timeline that it seemed impossible suddenly became merely challenging. Freddie's remaining requirements included completion of the parenting education classes, the final psychological evaluation, and home study inspection. Under normal circumstances, these elements would be spread across several months, but with the coordinated effort of everyone who had rallied to support his cause, compressed scheduling became possible.
The parenting classes, typically offered once weekly over 8 sessions, were consolidated into 2 intensive weekend workshops led by Dr. Sarah Martinez, a child psychologist who specialized in adoption preparation. Her sessions covered everything from attachment theory to discipline strategies, from trauma-informed care to age-appropriate communication techniques. Single-parent adoption requires particular attention to building support networks, Dr. Martinez explained during a session focused on family structure considerations. Children need multiple caring adults in their lives, and single parents need resources they can rely on during challenging periods. Freddie found himself thinking about the network that had spontaneously formed around his adoption effort. Patricia's organizational skills, Amelia's emotional support, the professional colleagues who had offered character references, even Mrs. Kim's letter about his reliability. Without consciously planning it, he had apparently been building exactly the kind of community connections that successful single parents required. The psychological evaluation, conducted by Dr. Robert Kim, explored territories that Freddie had been avoiding for decades. Dr. Kim's questions probed his childhood experiences with loss and abandonment, his adult patterns of emotional self-protection, and his motivations for seeking to become a parent at this stage of his life. Your profile suggests someone who has achieved professional success by minimizing emotional risk, Dr. Kim observed during their final session. Parenting requires exactly the opposite approach, maximum emotional investment with no guarantee of specific outcomes. What gives you confidence that you can make that adjustment? Lily, Freddie replied without hesitation. She asked me to be her father with complete trust, despite having every reason to protect herself from adult disappointment. If a 7-year-old can choose hope over fear, I think I can learn to do the same. Dr. Kim made notes with the satisfied expression of someone whose professional assessment aligned with his personal observations. Your profile appears genuine, and your support system is remarkably strong. I'll be recommending approval for your adoption petition. The home study inspection required transforming his minimalist penthouse into a space suitable for a 7-year-old's physical and emotional needs. The office became a bedroom, decorated with furniture Amelia helped him select during a whirlwind shopping expedition that introduced him to the world of child-appropriate design considerations. Safety locks appeared on cabinets, electrical outlets received protective covers, and the stark walls gained colorful artwork that would make Lily feel welcome. But the most important transformation was invisible to official inspection. Freddie's carefully controlled schedule expanded to accommodate school pickup times, homework assistance, weekend activities, and the countless small moments that constituted daily family life. His business calendar, once packed with meetings and travel, now included blocks of time marked simply as Lily. On the evening before the court hearing that would determine their future, Freddie visited Riverside Children's Home for what might be his final conversation with Lily as a prospective rather than actual father. He found her in the common room, working on a new drawing that showed 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of a building that looked remarkably like his Manhattan apartment building. "That's us," she explained when he asked about the artwork, "in front of our home. I drew it to show the judge tomorrow that I can picture us being a real family." Looking at Lily's drawing, Freddie realized that the most convincing evidence of his readiness for fatherhood wasn't contained in psychological evaluations or character references or home study reports. It was sitting beside him in the form of a 7-year-old who had chosen him with the wisdom that adults spent years learning to trust and who had waited patiently while he learned to choose her back.
The courtroom on Thursday morning felt like the culmination of everything Freddie had been working toward since that first afternoon when Lily had asked him to be her daddy. Judge Margaret Chen presided over the proceedings with the dignified authority of someone who understood that family court decisions shaped lives in ways that extended far beyond legal documentation. The formal setting, with its polished wood surfaces and official seals, provided a stark contrast to the deeply personal nature of the decision being made. Freddie sat at the petitioner's table wearing his best suit, but for once his professional appearance felt secondary to the emotional weight of the moment. Beside him, his attorney David Ross organized documents that represented months of preparation, evaluation, and community support. Behind them, the gallery contained an unprecedented gathering of character witnesses who had taken time from their own schedules to demonstrate their confidence in Freddie's potential as a father. Amelia had flown in from Portland, her presence providing the kind of family support that adoption courts valued as evidence of stable relationship networks. Patricia sat in the front row, her usual professional composure softened by genuine emotional investment in the outcome. Dr. Torres, Rebecca Walsh, and James Harrison occupied seats that testified to the breadth of professional colleagues who had observed Freddie's character over years of business interactions. But the most important person in the room was Lily herself, dressed in her best outfit and sitting with Sarah Wellington in the section designated for children involved in adoption proceedings. At 7 years old, she was too young for her preferences to be legally binding, but old enough for her voice to carry significant weight in judicial decisions about her future welfare.
Judge Chen began the hearing by reviewing the comprehensive documentation that supported Freddie's petition. "Mr. Montes," she said, addressing him directly, "your application presents an unusual case. Single-parent adoptions require particularly careful evaluation, and your lack of previous parenting experience initially raised concerns among the reviewing social workers. However, the depth of community support you've generated, combined with the expedited completion of all required preparations, suggests a level of commitment that addresses many of those concerns." She turned to Sarah Wellington next. "Miss Wellington, as Lily's caseworker, what is your professional assessment of this proposed placement?" Sarah stood with the confident bearing of someone whose recommendation carried the weight of 20 years' experience with child welfare decisions. "Your Honor, I have observed Mr. Montes's interactions with Lily over the past several months, and I believe this placement represents the best available option for her long-term welfare. His financial resources ensure educational and medical security, but more importantly, his emotional connection with Lily demonstrates the kind of genuine care that successful adoptions require." She paused, glancing at Lily before continuing. "I should also note that Lily has consistently expressed her preference for this placement, even when presented with alternative family options that might appear more conventional on paper. Her emotional maturity and clear communication about her needs suggest that her preferences should be given considerable weight in this decision." Judge Chen nodded, making notes before addressing Dr. Kim, whose psychological evaluation had been crucial in establishing Freddie's emotional readiness for single parenthood. "Dr. Kim, please summarize your assessment of Mr. Montes's psychological fitness for single-parent adoption." Dr. Kim stood, consulting his notes briefly before delivering his professional opinion. "Your Honor, Mr. Montes presents a profile of someone who has achieved significant personal growth during the adoption preparation process. His childhood experiences with loss and institutional care have provided him with genuine empathy for Lily's situation, while his professional success demonstrates the stability and resources necessary for effective parenting." He gestured toward the gallery of supporters. "Perhaps most significantly, the community response to his adoption petition reveals someone whose character has impressed colleagues and service providers over many years. This suggests that his capacity for forming meaningful relationships extends beyond his connection with Lily to encompass the broader support network that successful single parents require." The testimony continued with character witnesses providing specific examples of Freddie's integrity, reliability, and genuine care for others.
Dr. Torres described his consistent support for pediatric medical programs, emphasizing his understanding of children's unique needs and vulnerabilities. Rebecca Walsh testified about his educational philanthropy, noting his particular interest in literacy programs that serve children from circumstances similar to Lily's background. James Harrison's testimony provided perhaps the most compelling evidence of Freddie's character. "Your Honor," Harrison said with the directness that marked successful business leaders, "I've competed against Freddie Montes for over a decade, and I can tell you that he's the most ethical executive in our industry. But more than that, I've watched him transform over the past few months from someone who lived only for work to someone who has reorganized his entire life around the possibility of becoming a father. That level of personal change requires the kind of courage and commitment that makes for good parenting." When the character testimony concluded, Judge Chen turned her attention to Lily. "Lily, I know you've talked with Mrs. Wellington about your feelings regarding adoption, but I'd like to hear directly from you about what you're hoping for in a family." Lily stood with the careful posture of someone who understood the importance of the moment. Her voice carried clearly through the courtroom as she delivered what amounted to a 7-year-old's closing argument for the family she wanted. "Your Honor," she began, her formal address suggesting that Sarah had prepared her for courtroom protocol. "I know that some people think I should want a family with a mommy and daddy and other kids, because that's what normal families look like. But I asked Mr. Montes to be my daddy because something about him felt right, not because I was looking for the biggest family or the most people." She paused, glancing at Freddie with the kind of trust that made his heart clench. "He listens to me when I ask questions about how things work, and he doesn't get impatient when I want to understand everything. He brought me books about science when I said I liked learning, and he's been learning about being a daddy just like I've been learning about being a daughter. We've been practicing being a family together, and it feels like the right kind of practicing." The courtroom fell silent as Lily concluded with words that cut straight to the heart of what adoption meant from a child's perspective. "I know Mr. Montes can take care of me because he's been taking care of me already just by visiting and listening and making promises he keeps. I don't need the biggest house or the most toys. I just need someone who thinks I'm worth learning how to love, and he already decided I am."
Judge Chen took several minutes to review her notes before delivering her decision. When she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of judicial authority combined with genuine emotion about the case before her. "Mr. Montes, this court finds that you have demonstrated exceptional commitment to preparing for the responsibilities of single-parent adoption. The community support you've generated, combined with your completion of all required preparations and your obvious emotional connection with Lily, provides compelling evidence that this placement serves her best interests." She turned to Lily with a smile that transformed her judicial demeanor into something warmer and more personal. "Lily, the court is impressed by your maturity and clear communication about your preferences. Your voice has been an important part of this decision." Looking back at Freddie, Judge Chen delivered the words that would change both their lives forever. "Mr. Montes, I hereby approve your petition to adopt Lily Chen. Congratulations to both of you on your new family." The courtroom erupted in applause as Freddie felt tears he hadn't shed in decades streaming down his face. Lily ran from her seat to his arms, and as he lifted her up, he realized that this moment represented not just legal adoption, but the completion of a transformation that had begun with 3 simple words. "Will you be my daddy?" Looking around the courtroom at the faces of everyone who had supported their journey, Freddie understood that they hadn't just created a 2-person family. They had been embraced by a community that had recognized their connection and chosen to help them build something beautiful together. In that moment, with Lily in his arms and surrounded by people who had believed in their potential as a family, Freddie Montes finally understood what it meant to choose love over fear, hope over control, and the immeasurable value of caring for someone more than himself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.